Welcome to Authors Night 2020, the East Hampton Library's 16th annual celebration of authors and books. Tonight we have a great treat. We're joined by two highly respected journalists. First, let me introduce you to Phil Rucker, author of A Very Stable Genius, Donald J. Trump's Testing of America. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and the White House bureau chief at the Washington Post, where he's worked since 2005. He currently covers the Trump administration and has previously covered Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. Phil has been called one of Washington, D.C.'s most respected journalists. We're also thrilled to have East Hampton's own Lynn Sherr, who will be interviewing Phil this evening. Lynn is also an award-winning journalist, well known for her work as a correspondent for the ABC News magazine 2020. As well as many other broadcast shows. She is also a best-selling nonfiction author and has joined us at previous authors' nights, both as a celebrated author and a dinner party host. So now I'm going to turn this over to Lynn.
Thank you, Sheila, and welcome to all of you who, like me, want to support our fabulous library. It's a great institution and we're so lucky to have it there. So thanks to Sheila and Dennis for all that. And welcome, Phil, to East Hampton. I hope you get out here in person at some point and appreciate number one, what a great library we have and how we treat authors out here like the gods and goddesses that they actually are. So welcome to East Hampton, Phil.
I love that welcome, and thank you guys for being here, and thank you so much for thinking to include me in this. I was looking forward to making it up there this summer, and then of course COVID-19 struck, and that changed all of our lives. So you're going to get me from my living room, or from my dining room rather, in Washington D.C., which is not nearly as nice as the Hamptons this time of year, but I'm with you in spirit, and I'm glad you're all here for a fun hour of conversation.
Great. Let's start with the book. I want to start with the title of your book, A Very Stable Genius. What a brilliant choice for you to quote himself in this book as the title. These, of course, these were his words. What led you to use that as the title? So smart.
You know, we actually didn't come up with the title till we were pretty much near completion of the manuscript. My co-author, Carol Leonnig, and I, and together with our editor, Ann Godoff at Penguin Press, we were struggling over a title actually, and wanted to have something fresh and distinctive. But at the end, you know, we realized our book is really a character study. It's a history of these 3.5 years, but it's a character study too of this man, of President Trump, and what he's done in office. And we started to think about how to describe that in a title. And we realized, you know what, it's so funny that he calls himself a very stable genius. And, you know, that could be a perfect title. And we were a little hesitant, to be honest with you, about using it, because we thought maybe people would view it as snarky or making light of him. But we, as a deadly serious title, I mean, that is how he views himself. And we sort of hold that description up as a mirror onto the president. And our book stress tests it against the accounts of more than 200 of his advisors and administration officials and confidants. And, you know, the conclusion that they reach and that we reach in the book, of course, is that he's not particularly stable, and he's not what most would consider a genius.
You brought up the fact that you spoke to more than 200 people, confidants, people that work with him. I know you're not going to give us any of their names, but I wonder if you could tell us why they spoke to you. Are they frustrated on the job? Are they looking for fame and glory? Are they trying to get out? And if so, why don't they just leave and write their own books? Why does someone do this?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question, and there's no clean answer. And what I mean by that is, you know, everyone has their own motivations and their own reasons for speaking with us. And it's certainly the three that you mentioned were considerations that some of them made, but a lot of them agreed to talk to us for the sake of history. They, you know, Carol and I, it was not easy to get people to open up and share the sorts of stories they shared for this book, but they did so because we said, look, we're writing a historical accounting of what we've all lived through and what you've lived through up close in a way that nobody else in this country has. You know, you've seen the man in power, seen what he's done to this office. The country deserves to know the full story and the full truth, and we're here to help you tell it. And a lot of them agreed to talk to us, and we spent hours in a lot of these interviews. You know, one of them, it was 5 hours long around a dining table, just talking moment after moment after moment. We reviewed calendar entries, we reviewed diary entries in some cases. We asked sources to go back and go through their notes to make sure that what they're telling us was correct. And by the way, we're not just stenographers here. We're not only writing in our book what people told us, but we did a lot of rigorous fact checking and reporting and stress test the accounts of these people against the accounts of others in the administration to verify this information and make sure that everything we have in this book was the truth as best as we could determine it.
So, but there's more to that question, because you say they wanted to get history straight. And the stories you tell are just extraordinary. Those of you who haven't yet read the book, I know it came out back in February, get it now. Even though you think you've heard about it all over TV and in print, read it, because there's so much more in there. And some of the stories you tell are just mind-boggling. You talk about the meetings with Rex Tillerson, and you talk about Tillerson saying about Trump, he's an effing moron. You talk about Trump saying to his generals, you're a bunch of dopes. You talk about Mattis. Just one more question on this issue. Why are these people still there?
Well, some of them are gone. Rex Tillerson has left, but you know, the more pressing question might be, why are these people still silent? And you know, we all remember the interview, the editorial, I guess, that Jim Mattis gave a month or two ago, speaking out for the first time about the president's leadership in the pandemic. But for years, Mattis was personally very troubled by what he was witnessing from this president and did not say anything. He didn't even say anything negative about the president in his own memoir that came out about a year ago. Rex Tillerson has kept his silence to this day. He has not been critical publicly on the record of the president.
And why? What's the reason for that?
You know, part of it, Lynn, is that they feel like they owe it to the president to not criticize him while he's still in office. They feel sort of honor bound by this old school notion that, you know, you don't criticize a sitting president while he's still on the job. Of course, that's one of those norms that Trump would bust through in a heartbeat. I mean, he's broken so many of the old-fashioned norms of our country and of the White House in particular. But people like Mattis and Tillerson, John Kelly to some degree, you know, they came up through our country, through our system, and are protective of those norms and traditions and values, and just felt it was dishonorable to criticize the president while he's still in the job.
I'm tempted to ask you, and when going through it, I was tempted to say, you know, what's the most egregious thing you discovered about him? And I'm going to spare you that question because I have a feeling the list is very long, although if you've got an answer, please go right ahead. But since it is a book about character, let's talk a little bit about his character. And one of the things that stands out to me, so flashing marquee lights, is the way he likes to humiliate people. You talk about how he fires people by tweets, things he says to them. What did you learn about that, and what does that tell you about him?
You know, I'm so glad you seized on that, because it is a feature of his management style, and it's really a window into his character as a man, as a human being. He's vengeful. He harbors grudges. He wants to seek revenge when he feels wronged in some way. And the one interesting thing, by the way, about how he fires people is he very rarely is the one who actually says you're fired. That was, of course, his quote on The Apprentice and what made him famous on television all around the country, but he doesn't actually confront people face to face to fire them. He usually makes one of his subordinates do it. And I'll give you one example that we detail pretty vividly in the book, and it's the firing of Rex Tillerson as the Secretary of State. This was when Tillerson was on his first big trip, week-long trip to Africa. And of course, the reason he went on that trip to Africa was because President Trump had called African countries shithole countries and mocked them. And so Tillerson was sent on a diplomatic mission to Africa to try to repair relations with leaders on the continent in different countries. So Tillerson's in Africa. He got sick with some sort of a stomach bug from something he ate. He's in his hotel and he's getting these frantic messages, calls from John Kelly, who at the time was the chief of staff in the White House. And John is saying, Rex, you got to get back. You got to get back. Come back a couple of days early. Just get back to Washington. Kelly wasn't quite direct Tillerson about what exactly was so pressing and why Tillerson needed to get back. But in a succession of calls, Kelly made it clear to Tillerson that the president was about to fire him, and Kelly was trying to protect Tillerson because he knew that Trump wanted to fire Tillerson, and he knew he wanted to do it in a tweet. And Kelly didn't want the tweet to land while Tillerson was abroad on a cleanup mission in Africa. So long story short, Tillerson comes back a day early and is in Washington, and he lands, in the middle of the night, and he goes back to his home. And first thing that morning, as Tillerson's waking up, comes the tweet from the president, Mike Pompeo is our new Secretary of State. I thank Rex Tillerson for his service. No communication. Trump didn't even pick up the phone to fire Tillerson, just announced it on Twitter. And then a few days later, Trump called Tillerson and said, Rex, I want you to come into the Oval Office and we'll do photos. I'll take a picture with you and autograph it for you as a goodbye, as a departure gift. And of course, Tillerson never made it to the Oval Office and was not interested in the autographed photo.
I mean, this is a man who's essentially a sadist, right?
That's your description. I cover him day in and day out and have to maintain some level of objectivity, so I'm not going to use that word, but he's certainly, he is certainly motivated in unusual ways.
Among the other wonderful stories you tell, you talk about Mueller, you talk about, tell the story about Chris Christie coming for the interview for Chief of Staff and how Trump is his own best press guy.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite stories. And by the way, if any of you watched the interview that Trump did with X on HBO a couple of days ago, the correspondent doing that interview was Jonathan Swan, and he figures in this story. So this is December of 2018, and Trump is getting ready to give John Kelly the boot. He wants a new chief of staff at the White House, and he calls, actually Rudy Giuliani calls Chris Christie to give him a heads up that Trump wants Christie to be chief of staff. And Trump summons for Christie and says, Chris, can you come down to the White House? I want you to come to the residence and meet with me and Melania. We just want to catch up. And so Christie knows what's going on. He gets on the Amtrak, starts to head down to DC for this meeting with the Trumps. And he's thinking through, oh my God, what if Trump tries to offer me the chief of staff job? What do I do? He doesn't really want to do the job. And so he calls Jim Baker, the former chief of staff, is considered sort of the dean of chiefs of staff who served in the George H.W. Bush White House, calls Baker and says, Jim, what are the things I should keep in mind? And Baker goes through a list of, 10 or 12 points that Christie should advocate for. Anyhow, they're in this meeting. He's going over everything with Trump in the meeting. Trump offers him the job, says, I want you to be my chief of staff. Christie says, I need a little time to think about it. I've got to talk about it with Mary Pat, my wife. So they agree to talk again the next day, and Christie goes over to Union Station to get back on the Amtrak to head home to New Jersey. And he only made it to the Wilmington, Delaware stop about a little over an hour when his phone buzzed with a news alert from Axios saying Trump is picking Chris Christie as the chief of staff. And Christie thinks, how on earth did they find out about this? Nobody else was in the meeting except Trump and Melania. And they snuck in the back entrance of the White House. He wasn't spotted by anybody. Nobody knew he was there. And the next day when Christie calls Trump to tell him, thanks, but no thanks, I'm not going to take the job, Trump says, by the way, how'd you like that story last night? And Christie says, I was wondering about that. How did Jonathan Swan find out about this? And Trump says, oh, I called him and told him. He's a good guy. I leaked it I leaked it to him, and Christie thought, holy cow, the president's leaking on himself. How can you be the chief of staff in this kind of an environment?
And that was the end of that.
That was the end of that. And Christie, of course, did not take the job.
As long as you bring up John Swan, and there is no need here to tout another reporter when you're such an unbelievable, extraordinary reporter. But I do have a question, and a lot of people are asking this question, which is what John Swan did in that interview with Donald Trump was he simply stopped him every time, or most of the times, he told a lie, or he exaggerated, or he went backwards, or he said something totally absurd. John Swan stopped him on it and said, no, that's not right. Or how can you say that? Or what are you talking about? Why does no one do that on a daily basis? Why are you not able to do that in the White House when you have your press conferences with him?
That's a great question. And it's worth pointing out, by the way, and Jonathan did a terrific job with that interview. Chris Wallace also also did some of that live fact checking in his interview a couple of weeks prior, and it's encouraging to see that. You know, I will just say it's very difficult to have that sort of a dynamic, that back and forth with follow-ups when you're in a bigger press conference setting. It's virtually impossible when the president is taking questions under the wing of Air Force One or on the lawn before he gets into the helicopter, because you have the jet engine or the rotors going, and it's just very loud. You know, the president can barely hear you shout your question. There's not really a way to have a real give and take there. In the briefing room, there should be more fact checking in real time of the president. There should be more pushback. You know, not all of the reporters who attend those briefings are as aggressive and adversarial as others. So, you know, we're not all equal in that regard, but it is more difficult when you're not in a one-on-one conversation. If you're seated and you're the only journalist and the only one asking questions, the president has to answer. He has to converse with you. In a broader setting, if you're popping off follow-up questions, he takes over the mic and calls on somebody else, and it becomes a bit of a circus. So, you know, the forums are different. That's no excuse for not doing it, but it's at least a behind the scenes explanation for why you don't see it more often.
And for those who have never been reporters or understand how the White House press corps or the White House works, share with us also the logistics. Number one, their ability to cut off your mic. And number two, what about their ability to cut off your access?
Well, they certainly, the White House does control the microphones, especially in the Rose Garden. It's one of the reasons why the president likes doing so many of these news conferences in the Rose Garden, because his staff literally hold the microphone. They'll control it sometimes, or they'll let you hold it when you ask your question and then take it away when the president starts answering. So if you're going to follow up with him, there's no way for viewers on television to hear what you're saying. So it defeats that purpose. The cutting off access is less of a concern, I think. You know, it's honestly not something I really think about when I'm covering this White House, because there are so many staff and so many sources who are going to continue to talk good reporters because what they're witnessing is crazy, and because good reporters have developed trust and relationships with these sources over the years, that if the press shop says, you know, you're blacklisted for a week or whatever, we can still do our jobs just fine. So it's not as much of a pressing concern for me in this current environment, but you're correct to say that it's something that journalists have to think about, and certainly in a normal White House environment, that's a greater concern.
You said before that when I asked you why people were still working for him, your question is, why are they still silent? And I guess what I want to ask you is, whose book, yet unwritten, do you want to read?
That's a great question. You know, there are a few that I'd want to read, but it would depend on what the book is really, what sort of angle the book takes. The person in Trump's orbit who has seen the most up close with the president from day one till today, and who would have the most interesting stories to share, I think, is Hope Hicks. I don't know if that name rings a bell for folks here, but she started off, she's fairly young. She started off as the president's press secretary on the campaign and quickly sort of became much more than that. She's sort of a counselor, an advisor, a confidant. You might even call her an amateur psychologist at times in terms of helping manage his moods and manage how he grapples with these crises. She left for a while from the White House, but she's back in there now in a behind the scenes role very close to the president. She's probably seen more and witnessed more of Donald Trump over the years than anybody else in that White House, and would have a hell of a story to share, but she'd have to share the story. And she to date has been very loyal to him and shown no interest in spilling the beans, so to speak.
So go after her, publisher. She's the book we want next. You know, so much of the angst over Trump is also about the angst over his loyal base. Those, however much it shrinks or enlarges from time to time, there's a group of people who still love him. We're out here on the East End of Long Island. He's coming to are you coming out for the fundraiser, by the way? There's a big fundraiser, couple of fundraisers.
I know, this weekend. I won't be there. My colleague will be there, but.
So there's a whole new list of products to boycott based on the people who are giving him his fundraisers this weekend.
So it's no longer Equinox.
No longer, no. Now we're up to Nathan's hot dogs and some other things. But anyway, happy to report that there are a lot of Goya beans on the shelves in the supermarkets out there. The others are taken away. However, having said that, so there's Trump, and there's the people around him, and then there's his base. What does your reporting tell you about the people who support him so loyally? And the second part of the question is, how do we get our country back and our institutions back?
Those are two complicated questions there. You know, the president's base is, it's a remarkable study because, and I spent a lot of time in 2016 and 2015 at his rallies interviewing his supporters and his base voters to find out exactly why they're so drawn to him. And, you know, they just feel like he represents them and gives voice to their grievances and their concerns. And, you know, yes, it's socioeconomic, but yes, it's also racism too, to some degree. You know, there are a lot of supporters who just feel a lot of working class white people out in the country that have been going to these rallies, and when you talk to them, they feel like they're being excluded from the new America, like they're struggling to make ends meet. They're, you know, watching their communities diversify in ways that make them feel uncomfortable, and they feel very threatened by the makeup of our country demographically, and have rallied under the banner of Trumpism and make America great again. And Trump doesn't hide, you know, that he's appealing to that. That's a big part of the base. You know, the base also includes all sorts of other people, you know, a lot of evangelical supporters, certainly a lot of Republican financial types who are really not okay with the president morally or ethically or on any number of issues, but feel like, you know, he's in their economic interests, and so they vote for him anyways. You know, that's a complicated thing to describe the Trump base writ large, but there are a lot of currents through it, and Trump has an incredible hold on that base because given the way he has managed this pandemic and all of the other crises that he's had to navigate the last few years, any ordinary politician would be at a much lower stake than Trump is right now. The fact that he has a chance here to win a second term, given the way he's handled the first term, speaks volumes about the intensity of his support within his base and the connection that he has to those people.
And the second part of the question, which is almost more important, which is we've seen faith, trust in institutions from the Supreme Court to the press, essentially demoralized, eroded. How do we get that back, do you think?
You know, I don't know. It's something that I think about a lot because it's pretty much every institution in this country that has become eroded in these 4 years, and there's a real divide. Half of this country believes one thing, and another half of the country believes something entirely different.
Is it, by
about
the way, is it
institutions,
really?
about fact.
Wait,
about truth.
is it really half and half, or do you think?
It's easy to say half and half, but you are correct. It is not half and half. There's a very vocal minority, and this is according to every poll, but it's also according to the 2016 popular vote, and then a majority. I think these institutions can hold, if there's sort of a pause and a reset, and that's one of the things that Joe Biden is promising in his campaign, a restoration. I think if this degradation of the institutions continues, though, for another 4 years, I don't know what the country will look like, at the end of this period. But there has been so much dramatic change in functions of our government and our social institutions and the media in just these last 4 years that an additional 4 years could make some of these things more permanent.
Let's talk about politics for a little bit. What does it say to you that Mitch McConnell has said to some of his folks, his Republicans, if you need to distance yourself from Trump while you're running, it's okay? What's that about?
That's about Mitch McConnell wanting to be the Senate Majority Leader still. He wants there to be a Republican president, but he owes nothing to Donald Trump, and he's not a particular fan of Donald Trump's. And his interest is first and foremost Mitch McConnell and the Senate. And so that tells you that the president is unpopular and is a drag on a number of these embattled Republican senators. And if you don't believe Mitch McConnell, just look at virtually every public poll that we've seen this summer. The president is pulling these Republican candidates down. There's a new Quinnipiac poll just out today that shows the Senate race in South Carolina, which we all think of as a very solidly Republican state. The Senate race is tied 44-44, Republican incumbent Lindsey Graham against Democratic challenger Jamie Harrison. The fact that Lindsey Graham is at 44% and tied in his reelection quest in South Carolina tells you an awful lot about the state of the president and the state of his Republican Party. And I think you're going to start to see some of these Republican senators create more distance if they can. Look at Joni Ernst in Iowa, back home in her campaign. She's not talking about Trump. She's trying to talk about everything but Trump. Martha McSally has a really uphill battle in Arizona, but other states as well. Tom Tillis in North Carolina, Susan Collins in Maine. These candidates are all trying to create independent brands to distance themselves from Trump, so that when voters go to the polls in November, or when they vote early by mail, they might consider for Joe Biden, but then also voting for the Republican senator. They just don't want people to vote straight up and down the ticket Democratic, because the Republicans are going to lose the Senate majority of the case.
What do you think the chances are of the Senate going Democratic?
I think if the election were held today, it would go Democratic. But 3 months is a long time, and a lot in those Senate races, frankly, just on what the national mood is like, and how the presidential race fares. If the president ends up being the blowout that it appears to be today, and if Trump is deeply underwater because of his handling of the coronavirus pandemic, then it's very likely that enough of these Republican Senate seats are going to flip into Democratic hands to give Democrats the majority. But there could be a more natural, balancing out in the polls in the months to come. And talking the last few weeks to strategists in both parties, they anticipate that there will be a tightening in the race after Labor Day, that some of these Republican voters who are telling pollsters that they're going to vote for Democrat may end up coming home to the Republicans at the end. That doesn't mean the Republicans will win the Senate, but it might be a closer contest than the polls today are indicating.
You talked about the virus, and we haven't talked about that yet at all. One thing I'm very curious about, you've been in the room when Trump is there and Anthony Fauci is there. We all have seen a lot of reporting. We see what it looks like. What does it feel like when they're together? Is there hostility there? Is Fauci sort of gritting his teeth all the time? Is he such an extraordinary human being that he can do his job and not let it get to him? Or is there something happening? What is Trump's feeling about him? Do you get any feel for that when you're in the room with him?
You know, they have a really interesting relationship. According to our reporting, when talking to each other in Oval Office meetings, which are rare these days, but when they're actually conversing with one another, they have a pretty warm rapport, and they have kind of a buddy-buddy thing on. You know, Fauci is a gregarious, kind person, and is easy to get along with and talk to. And you know, Trump can be charismatic in his own way, and he and Fauci seem to get along. But when you're in that briefing room and Fauci's at the microphone, and again, we don't see this very often anymore, but back in the thing, we saw it almost every day. When Fauci's at the microphone speaking truth and saying things that the president doesn't want the American people to hear, you can feel the tension in the room. You know the president is disapproving just by his body language and by the way he folds his arms and by the way he stares at Fauci. There's a real iciness at the podium when Fauci does that, and that might be one of the reasons why you don't see Fauci at these briefings anymore. You know, there's another dynamic to keep an eye on too, and that's Dr. Deborah Birx. I was in the White House briefing room the day when the president listened to a presentation about how heat from the summer outdoors could melt the virus away. And when the president turned to the doctors and asked whether they could look at injecting disinfectant into the body, like, you know, literally injecting bleach into your veins.
I think we all remember that moment.
We all remember that. Well, Deborah Birx, Dr. Birx was sitting in a seat on the side of the room, just totally trying to stay composed, and just had a sign of complete disbelief on her face. Like, she could not imagine that this is the president of the United States and that this is what he's proposing on live television in the middle of a pandemic. And so you can just, sometimes looking at the side of the room, you see the body language and the tension, even behind a mask, you know what these people are feeling.
Phil, I know you're a reporter. You're not a doctor. You're not a psychiatrist. You obviously know all the comments that have been made, the amateur analyses that have been made, the diagnoses that have been made about his mental state.
Yeah, I do follow George Conway on Twitter. So.
Okay, as well as his physiological state, his physical state. Yeah. Are you in a position to have observed anything you can share with us about either his mental capacity or his physical body capacity at this point that you've seen over the couple of years?
Nothing. No, not really. I mean, I see him up close a lot over the years, and have interviewed him a number of times, and been very close to him on the airplane and in various settings. But I'm not qualified to draw any conclusions, and even anecdotally, I don't. No, there's nothing I can really say about that.
One more political thing I meant to ask. What do you make of Mike Pence speaking out against Chief Justice Roberts? I'm not naive enough to say no one's ever politicized the Supreme Court. Of course they have. Go back to FDR. But this seemed kind of amazing for a sitting vice president to criticize a sitting Chief Justice for not essentially voting their way.
I too found that very striking. You know, it's in keeping, of course, with what President Trump has said. But to hear it from Pence is kind of next level, because you don't expect that sort of commentary from the vice president. That said, I think there's a political strategy at play here. The Trump campaign in 2016 determined it was very advantageous to talk about the court and to release that list of all the people he would consider nominating for the Supreme Court should he have a vacancy to fill as president, and to really make that a campaign issue. It helped galvanize conservatives, especially Christian conservatives, evangelical conservatives, to turn out in very large numbers because they care a lot about the Supreme Court, but also the rest of the judiciary. And so this may be an effort to kind of keep the Supreme Court alive as a voting issue in the 2020 election. talking about Roberts, talking about how the existing court is not conservative enough for Trump and Pence's liking, how, the implication, of course, being that if President Trump were to win a second term, he would potentially have future vacancies to fill, and he would then put in, real conservatives, not conservatives like Roberts, onto the bench. That may be kind of the wink argument that Pence was trying to get at that interview. I'm not sure, but I certainly see campaign politics at play in the discussion of Roberts.
Does your reporting indicate anything about the possibility of Trump dumping Pence?
Nothing beyond rumor. There's been chatter about that for a while now, but it's never in my reporting of my colleagues. We've never found it to have any there. The president, to get back to his management style, he likes to talk to friends, to advisors about, what do you think of so-and-so? What do you think of this person? He can leave little hints in private conversations that he's dissatisfied with the vice president, or that he might entertain the idea of switching the ticket. But to my knowledge, there's nothing afoot. And frankly, looking at the calendar, it's getting a little late in the game to make a change like that. Now, I could be surprised, and we could all wake up and there's a 6 a.m. tweet tomorrow saying, I'm thrilled to announce that Nikki Haley is my new vice presidential running mate, and you guys can call me on it. But I have no reporting that suggests that there's anything real going on there.
I think at some point we're going to switch to some questions from viewers, and I'm still here with lots of questions, but let me ask you just one for the moment. I was talking to a group of very high-powered women today, and I mentioned that I was going to be interviewing you, and did any of them have a question for you? And one of them, a lawyer, said, please ask him. She said, how can he stand it day after day after day? She said, when he comes on the tube, I turn it off or I walk out of the room. Here's a guy who's got a job. He's got to listen to him every day. I know it sounds facetious, but I think there's something to it. What's your answer to that?
Well, first of all, it is my job to listen to it, to cover it, but to take all of this stuff really seriously, and to probe what's going on, and to not laugh these things off. I mean, this is our country. This is our president. This is what's happening. Every day, I frankly feel privileged to get to do this job, and to have the license and the access that the Washington Post provides me to be able to pursue these stories and uncover truth in a really challenging time. Now, as for how I personally can handle it, I'll just say I'm not a particularly partisan person. I don't get that exercised about politics, and I certainly have my own values and my own beliefs, but I'm not someone who feels so passionately about a particular politician or this particular president that I can't objectively, cover what's happening or suppress some of those feelings in an effort to, be a fair journalist and to find out the truth.
Is it in fact a kind of badge of honor that he called your book fiction?
I think so. He also called my co-author Carol and I stone cold losers. So, we thought that was pretty fun, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. To have written a brilliant nonfiction book, and to have the President of the United States say it's a work of fiction, I think has got to be pretty good for openers.
I will point out, Lynn, by the way, that even though he called it a book of fiction, he nor his staff have challenged a single anecdote or detail or quote in the book. There's not a single point in this book that Trump or anyone working for him has said is not true, or has asked for a correction on, or called unfactual in any way.
He's a great suer. He didn't threaten to sue you on anything?
Nope.
By the way, S-U-E.
But we were prepared if he had, so.
Yeah, I just want to make that clear. Sorry, he's a great litigator. He's very litigious.
Litigious, yes.
Yeah. Why do you think, Phil, there have been so many Trump books coming out? It feels as if There have been more with this presidential administration than any in my recent memory.
Definitely.
That's exactly true. There have been a ton of Trump books because some of them have been very, very successful. Not all of them are successful, and some, don't really find much of an audience. But the publishing industry clearly thinks that there's an interest among readers in learning more about this president. I will say one of the more gratifying things for us journalists to learn is that among the most successful Trump books have been the works of journalism. Bob Woodward's book, Fear, did very well. Our book, A Very Stable Genius, did very, very well. #1 bestseller in the New York Times. So people are buying real journalism with facts and new information, and that's gratifying. It's not the kind of slash and burn like Sean Spicer sycophant books or the polemics that are doing so well.
That is encouraging. That is very. Dennis, do you want me to let you take over, or should I keep going?
Let's open it up to questions from the audience. People can raise their hands and I'll unmute you. Who has a question? Richard Sloves.
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
This may be a little bit off base, but what is your reporting telling you about Republican operatives using Kanye West to facilitate Trump winning as a minority candidate?
I will regret to say I have not personally reported on this, but I've certainly followed the news accounts of what's been going on. It does not surprise me to hear this. I know that Trump advisors thought initially a few weeks ago when Kanye West expressed interest in running for president that it could actually help Trump because they believed that it could, Kanye West could siphon off some black voters away from Joe Biden, or siphon off young voters of any race away from Joe Biden. I don't know. I haven't actually seen polling about Kanye West. I'm not sure if there's any data to back up that assumption, or if that's just an assumption they're making based on who listens to Kanye West music. But that being said, Trump knows that he has a loyal base of 42%, maybe 44% on a good day in some of these states, and that if he can create an environment where he can win with a plurality rather than a majority in some of these electoral states, then that is advantageous for him.
Who's next?
While you're waiting, let me fill in the space here. Phil, what about the debates? What do you think will happen? What do you believe ought to happen? Should there be debates? Will there be debates? And so how many?
Well, the latest on that is that there will be 3 debates, 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. And I believe that they will all be in October, although somebody jump in if I have that wrong. That's just going off of my memory of the latest. The Trump campaign has made an argument that there should be an additional debate, a 4th debate with Joe Biden in September. And the case that they're making is because of the pandemic, so many more people are going to vote early by mail, that they should begin the debate in September before the voting really gets going. That the reason the Trump folks want to have an additional debate is because he's losing right now. So they want to create more opportunities for Trump to kind of change the momentum in the race. And the debate is obviously one of those opportunities where if Trump were to perform well and Biden were to perform poorly, it could potentially change the direction or the contours of the race. But 2 things. First of all, it's a big leap to assume that a debate automatically helps Donald Trump. He does not fare well in these interviews where he's questioned aggressively, Jonathan Swan or Chris Wallace. And I'm not sure that 90 minutes on a stage with Joe Biden and a moderator is necessarily going to be a good look for Trump, but they have a lot of confidence in his debating skills. But more importantly, I'm not really sure that anybody who is voting early by mail who is undecided and is not sure who to vote for is going to send their ballot in September. Like if they're really undecided, and very few people in America are actually undecided in this race. Most people have a pretty firm opinion about Donald Trump one way or another, but the undecided voters are probably going to wait till later in the fall to make their decision, to see how the race shakes up and see where we are with the pandemic and see how the debates go. So the Trump argument is based on there being some huge reservoir of votes that are going to be cast early before the debates, and that the debates could influence those votes. But I think anybody voting in September is voting because they are firmly of the belief that Trump either should be reelected or should not be reelected.
Right. And you talk about votes by mail. Let's talk about the post office a little bit. What is, out here we have a very small post office that has been overwhelmed by so many more people out here pre-summer and now in the summer than are usually here. And we hear about conspiracy theories about what's going on with the post office. What does your reporting tell you is going on?
Well, I will again regret on this point that I have not personally been reporting on this story. My colleagues at the Post have, but I've been reading about it and following it with some interest. And a few things are going on. There's a new Trump-appointed head of the Postal Service Commission or board, whatever it's called. I'm going to botch that name. But he's a Trump ally, a political appointee, and they have instituted some new procedures at the post office that are apparently are slowing down some of the mail service. This is according to some testimony before Congress this week. I don't know exactly what those procedures are or how it's really affecting the service, but the big picture here is that President Trump for months now has been trying to cast doubt about the efficiency of the Postal Service and the credibility of the Postal Service. And it all centers around his allegations of voter fraud. He is claiming that mail-in voting is fraudulent, is ripe for cheating. And one of the reasons it's ripe for cheating is because the Postal Service is overwhelmed, can't get its act together, can't be trusted to deliver the mail on time or accurately. And this is all an effort by the president to lay the groundwork for claiming that the election is rigged, or that the results are not true, or that if Joe Biden is declared the winner, that you can't actually believe that he's the winner because we don't actually know who voted. I mean, it's a very dangerous and destructive strategy for the president to be making, and really erodes the credibility of our democracy. But at the heart of that argument is the president's critique of the Postal Service.
But isn't going after the Postal Service when so many Republican voters live in rural communities or not big cities, at least, doesn't it hurt his own base to wreck the Postal Service?
That's a really good point, Lynn. Yes, I mean, a lot of his communities are served by the Postal Service, and and need the Postal Service to be operating well. But I would point out that, frankly, especially during the pandemic, every community needs the Postal Service. How many of us are ordering more Amazon packages? Like, we're all getting our toilet paper and our paper towels, and all that stuff is getting delivered by USPS or UPS or FedEx. I mean, those are essential workers out there right now trying to keep our communities and our families and our homes running. And so it's just really destructive to be trying to tear that institution down.
Yet another institution that we have to rebuild when this is all over, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Who else has a question? Oh, John, unmute you.
Can I just talk into it?
Yep, go ahead.
I understand, speaking about the post office, that in their negotiations, they had this new postal fellow, I think today or yesterday in the negotiations, and the Democrats, Pelosi and Schumer, laid the wood on him. And I think they're going to put into the stimulus bill that there are going to be certain restrictions on them and, more money. And in my recollection, the post office, there's an archaic law that the reason that they're, you know, I don't know if you want to call it money losing as a company, as an entity. You know, you correct me. I think there is some sort of a political reason why they lose money every year.
They're not supposed to be. They're not supposed to be a profit center. It was established by the federal government not to be a profit center. Am I wrong, Phil?
I think you're right about that, but this is really outside my area of expertise, so forgive me for that, but I think you're right. I mean, it's not a company, obviously. They're not there to make profit. They're there to just operate. And the postal fees that we, you know, spend on stamps or to ship goods is really to just keep the operation running. It's not for anybody to profit off of.
Talk a little bit. We haven't discussed the big elephant in the room, which is Putin. You have a wonderful story about Trump's obsession with Putin. Tell that story, and maybe you could explain why you think, based on your reporting, he is so obsessed with Putin.
Yeah, so there are actually a few interesting Putin stories in the book, so I hope I'm going to tell the one that you're thinking of, Lynn. But it's early. It's during the transition period at the end of 2016, before the president even takes office, and he is in Trump Tower in his office doing an interview with one of his Secretary of State candidates, and he interrupts the candidate, the job candidate, during this interview, and says, "When can we meet Putin?" He wanted to meet Vladimir Putin right away. And Reince Priebus, who was set to become the White House chief of staff, was sitting in on the interview, and he turns to Reince and he says, "Can we do it before the inauguration?" So President Trump wanted to have a bilateral meeting with the Russian president, before the inauguration, so while Barack Obama was still the president of the United States, but B, before communicating with any of our allies, before talking to the Prime Minister of the UK, Theresa May, before talking to Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, the Secretary General of NATO. You know, there's a protocol here that's been protected over the years in America, where we give special treatment to our allies, and Russia, Putin is not one of our allies. But the president was just infatuated with Putin and really aspired to be Putin's buddy, to have this kind of bromance going overseas. He thought Putin would be his Margaret Thatcher, the way Reagan had that special relationship with Thatcher. And he cultivated it in those early months. And you guys probably remember that trip Trump took to Hamburg, Germany, and there was a world leaders dinner one night during the G20 summit, and the president got up from his seat and went over to sit next to Putin, and they talked one-on-one for more than an hour on the sidelines of the dinner table, because Trump was uninterested in whoever he was sitting next to at the time, and wanted instead to talk to Putin.
How do you explain it?
You know, the truth is I can't get inside Donald Trump's head, so I don't know exactly what the motivation is there. And there are all sorts of theories, by the way, about his interest in Putin being driven by his previous business interests and the developments he wanted to do in Russia for the Trump organization. And then we all know that he was there in Moscow for the Miss Universe pageant many years ago. But I think at his core, Trump is jealous of Putin in a way. He admires Putin's strength as a leader, and what I mean by that is Putin governs as a totalitarian. He has his enemies executed. He rigs elections to maintain power. He silences civil dissent. He runs Russia the way I think Trump at his wishes could run the United States. He knows he can't run our country that way because we're a democracy and we're a different kind of country with different sorts of protections for free speech and for our people. But he does admire the way Putin can kind of rule with that iron fist.
So what's your next book, Phil?
It's a great question. There is nothing lined up, so we'll have to see.
You're not working on another book right now?
I'm not, no.
I assume the day-to-day. You know, when I was at ABC News, and we would get close to election time, often they would switch us around. So if you were the White House correspondent, you would get sent off to cover the challenging candidate. And if you were,
Oh yeah, yeah.
so I'm wondering, is there any, will you be sent off to cover Biden, or are you sticking with Putin? With Putin, jeez, very sorry. Are you sticking with Trump now?
With Putin. I'm staying at the White House and covering Trump at least through the duration of this year. You know, I think if this were a normal campaign, I probably would have wanted to, and the Washington Post would have wanted me to spend a week or two out on the road with Joe Biden and just feel for Biden as a candidate, and it just helps you obviously write and report with more authority the campaign as a whole if you're seeing both of the candidates. But of course, there's no actual campaigning right now, and there's not that sort of opportunity to be on the road. So I'm sitting here at home watching it all unfold, but I will continue to cover the White House through at least the end of this year.
And how will the fact that this will be a virtual campaign and 2 virtual conventions, how might that affect the outcome of this election, do you think?
That's a great question, and I don't think anybody knows the answer to that because we've never experienced anything like this. But you know, the virtual conventions, we'll have to see what the parties have planned and what the television coverage looks like. But it seems to me there's a possibility that they draw a fairly small audience and that they're not the big kind of message-defining events that they have been in past campaign cycles, because there's not really a way to replicate the energy and electricity of a live convention and the speech and all the people cheering and the stagecraft that comes with it. And so, you know, certainly I think both of the campaigns are putting together scripted programming that will highlight the messages they want to promote in their campaign, tell the stories of their candidate in the case of Joe Biden, or of the Trump record in the case of Donald Trump. But I just don't know that they're going to have the same level of impact that we're used to seeing from conventions.
Have you ever covered Joe Biden?
I have. I actually covered the Obama White House back at the beginning of his second term, and got to cover Vice President Biden then.
Give us a couple of closing words on Joe Biden.
You know, it's saying, you know, he's a remarkable American character just because he's lived through so much. He's experienced so much personal grief and trauma. And he's been at the forefront of our national issues for so long, and especially our foreign affairs. And, you know, he's been kind of a fixture in American politics for a long time. And, you know, what he's promising is sort of a pause and a restoration and a return to some semblance of normalcy, and then being a bridge to another generation, which, you know, if that's what the American people want, then he's of all of our political figures sort of the one who seems best positioned to do that. He's interesting. He's a charismatic man. He's you know, fairly down to earth, and he has a bit of a loose tongue. And what I mean by that is he chats a lot, and he says things that sometimes get him into trouble. But you know, Donald Trump is that way too. So we'll see. I think he's run a very interesting campaign because he's really tried as best he can to make it all about Trump, which is frankly one of the reasons why Biden is doing so well in the polls, because people around the country disapprove of Trump at the moment. But you know, we'll have to see how Biden really gets tested in these debates and what these closing months look like. And
any reporting or speculation on Biden's choice for vice president?
I don't know anything that we've not already reported, but you know, clearly he's already said he wants it to be a woman. It's very likely to be a Black woman, a woman of color. And the 3 top candidates, as we understand it, are Senator Kamala Harris and Congresswoman Karen Bass, and then Susan Rice, the former national security advisor. And I think any one of the 3 would be interesting for different reasons. And Rice clearly has the most personal relationship with Biden, since they worked so closely together in the Obama administration, and they have that connection and share a foreign policy worldview and mindset. But the dark horse, I think, the person to really keep an eye on is Karen Bass. People don't really know much about her, but she was very effective governing in the state of California as the Speaker of the House there. And she's got a very kind of quiet competence and a presence about her. And if Biden wants to double down on these themes of sort of competence, normalcy, calmness, no drama, then he may end up with Karen Bass, and that would be an interesting contrast to Trump.
Phil, I can't thank you enough. I want to say that as a New Yorker, I've always found it a little bit difficult to sell the Washington Post to my New York friends who are so entrenched with the Times. But
you got to try harder.
Well, I was about to say I have personally probably sold 4 dozen digital subscriptions to your paper because I think your reporting is so extraordinary, obviously at the White House, led by you, and across the board. And every one of you, after you rush out and buy Phil's book, A Very Stable Genius, please get a digital subscription or a regular subscription to the Washington Post. You will be rewarded greatly. Thank you, Phil, so much for this evening.
Thank you, Lynn, for the great conversation, and thanks to all of you guys for listening and for supporting the library. And hopefully, in better times, I'll make it up there. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.